Welcome to the Empathy Stories channel, where we bring you powerful tales of unexpected kindness and human connection. Today's story features Jack Harris, a successful millionaire whose life changes forever after he encounters two abandoned children on a cold Seattle night. This is a story of compassion, self-discovery, and the surprising twist life can take when we open our hearts. It was an evening like no other, the kind of night that pressed down with an invisible weight, heavy in the way only cold can be, where the streets seemed quieter and the city lights, those normally so bright and insistent, were muted, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Jack Harris, the man behind one of Seattle's most successful tech companies, sat alone in his sleek black Mercedes. He had been driving for an hour now, his mind still tangled with the events of the day. At 48, Jack had built a life many envied. He had it all: wealth, influence, a mansion on the outskirts of the city. And yet, something was missing. The city he ruled, an empire of glass and steel, had always been predictable. The skyline, a constant, reflected in the clear windows of his offices. But tonight, for reasons he couldn't articulate, Jack found himself veering off his usual route. Instead of heading directly home, he took an unfamiliar turn, almost as if guided by some instinct he didn't understand. He had never been one to give in to whims. Everything in his life was scheduled, planned, and controlled. But tonight felt different. The streets grew darker, the faint hum of the city receding as he drove deeper into a part of Seattle he rarely visited. This was no longer the polished, manicured side of the city he knew so well. Here, the buildings were older, the streets a little dirtier, the lights flickering sporadically, casting long, disorienting shadows. Jack found himself navigating through unfamiliar alleyways, the world outside his windows growing quieter and more desolate. And then he saw it: two figures, small, frail, and huddled in the cold, under the dim glow of a street lamp. His headlights illuminated them just as they would a fleeting moment in time. But it was enough. A young boy, no older than 6, was sitting on the sidewalk, holding a tiny bundle in his arms. Beside him, almost hidden in the dark, was a baby, wrapped in a threadbare blanket, barely visible against the cold, dark concrete. For a long moment, Jack simply stared. It was hard to process. He had seen poverty before. He had seen people on the streets, but something about this scene struck him in a way he wasn't prepared for. The child's face, pale and tired, looked up as Jack's headlights hit them, eyes wide with a mix of fear and vulnerability. Jack's chest tightened, and an inexplicable feeling surged through him. It wasn't just pity, it was something deeper. He couldn't look away. He was torn between the instinct to drive on, to avoid getting involved, something he had perfected over the years, and the magnetic pull of the situation unfolding before him. It wasn't just that the children were cold. It was that something in the boy's gaze, the quiet desperation, reached inside of Jack and tugged at something long buried. After a beat, Jack took a breath and did something he had never done before. Without thinking, he pulled the car over to the side of the road, the tires crunching against the gravel as he put the car in park. He stepped out into the biting cold, the chill of the air biting at his skin, the weight of the night pressing down on him. "Hey there," Jack said softly, his voice tentative as he approached the children. "Are you okay? Where are your parents?" He had no idea why he spoke in that tone, as if trying to comfort them, to reassure them. The boy didn't answer immediately. His eyes were wide and full of fear, scanning Jack's face with cautious curiosity. Jack waited, not wanting to spook him further. He knelt down to the boy's level, trying to make himself as unthreatening as possible. "You don't have to stay out here in the cold," he said. "Come with me. I'll help you." The boy's gaze flickered between Jack and the baby beside him. There was a long, silent moment, a brief hesitation. Jack held out his hand, trying not to be too insistent, too overwhelming. Slowly, with shaking hands, the boy reached for him. The small, cold fingers gripped his hand, and in that instant, Jack felt something shift within him. He wasn't sure what it was, but it was a mixture of protectiveness, confusion, and an overpowering sense of responsibility. Let me take you somewhere warm, Jack murmured. He gently scooped up the baby, who was barely moving, wrapped in the blanket, and held the fragile little form carefully in his arms. He led the boy, who was now walking alongside him, toward the car. The drive back to his mansion was quiet, the sound of the engine humming through the heavy silence that enveloped the car. Jack's thoughts were racing, but his mind couldn't quite make sense of what was happening. Who were these children? How had they ended up here? Alone, in the middle of the night? And more pressing, why had he felt this overwhelming need to help them? The mansion loomed in the distance as they approached, its silhouette against the dark sky a reminder of the life Jack had built. Isolated, pristine, untouched. But tonight, as the children sat silently in the back seat, the place didn't feel like home. It felt foreign, alien. When they arrived, Jack's longtime housekeeper, Nancy, opened the door with a soft smile, though it faltered as soon as she saw the children. "Mr. Harris," she began, clearly caught off guard. "Who are these children?" "I found them on the street," Jack replied, his voice low and uncertain. "They were alone, in the cold. They need help?" Nancy didn't question him further. She simply nodded, her eyes softening as she took in the sight of the small, trembling figures. Her maternal instincts kicked in immediately, and she led them inside without another word. Jack watched them disappear into the warmth of the house. But for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel the peace that usually came with the comfort of his home. Something had shifted inside him, something he wasn't ready to confront. As Nancy prepared food and a warm bath for the children, Jack stood by the fireplace in the living room, staring into the flames. Lost in thought, his life had been about control, about making things work on his terms. But this felt different. He had reached out to those children for reasons he couldn't explain. And now, as the quiet of the night settled around him, Jack couldn't help but wonder, what would tomorrow bring? The night had stretched on endlessly, as if the world itself had slowed down in anticipation. Jack couldn't sleep. He had tossed and turned in his massive, lonely bed, but no matter how much he tried to find rest, his thoughts kept pulling him back to the events of the evening. The boy's face, the baby's fragility, those images had burned themselves into his mind, refusing to be erased. He had brought them into his home without a second thought. But now, alone in the quiet of his mansion, he was left to wonder if it had been the right thing to do. Jack had always prided himself on making calculated decisions that made sense, that kept him in control. But this had been something else entirely. It felt like an instinct, a deep, undeniable pull to protect the children. Yet, the practical side of him couldn't help but ask, what was he getting into? Why had he reacted the way he had? The first light of morning crept in through the tall windows of the mansion, casting a pale glow on the grand interior. Jack lay there for a while, staring at the ceiling, before finally getting up. His feet padded softly across the polished wooden floors as he made his way to the kitchen, still trying to process everything. When he entered, Nancy was already busy with breakfast, moving around the kitchen with the grace of someone who had done this for years. She seemed unfazed by the events of the previous night, her focus entirely on the children. She had already prepared a warm meal for them and was now serving it at the dining table. Jack noticed the children immediately. Ethan, the boy he had found, was sitting at the table, carefully feeding the baby, whose name, Jack had learned, was Mia, with a spoon. Despite the tenderness of the gesture, there was something guarded about Ethan. His eyes flickered nervously to Jack, and for a moment, Jack could see the weight of the responsibility that had settled on the young boy's shoulders. Ethan couldn't have been more than 6, but there was a quiet, almost unnerving maturity in his eyes, a hardness that didn't belong to a child of his age. Jack had seen many things in his life: poverty, hardship, loss, but there was something about Ethan that unsettled him. This child, so young, had the weight of the world on him. As Jack stepped into the room, Ethan looked up, his expression a mixture of uncertainty and caution. Mia, in his arms, cooed softly, her tiny hands reaching for the food with innocent curiosity, unaware of the complexities around her. Jack's heart ached as he watched them. They were so young, so fragile, and yet so strong in their own way. It was almost as if they had been forced to grow up too quickly, burdened by circumstances far beyond their years. "Morning," Jack said gently, trying to break the silence. "How are they doing?" Nancy turned to him, her face softened with compassion. "They're adjusting. Ethan's been very protective of Mia. They've been through a lot. Mr. Harris, they're stronger than they look, but they'll need time." Jack nodded, though he couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. He had no idea what had happened to these children, but the more he saw of them, the more questions he had. Where had they come from? Why were they alone? And most importantly, who had come looking for them? As if on cue, there was a knock at the door, sharp, insistent. Jack's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected anyone to come so soon. His mind raced as he walked toward the door. But deep down, he had a sinking feeling that something was about to change. He opened the door to find two police officers standing on the doorstep, their faces serious and professional. "Mr. Harris?" One of them asked, his voice calm but firm. "I'm Detective Jordan, and this is my partner, Officer Ramirez. We're here about two missing children. We need to ask you some questions." Jack's stomach tightened, and his mind went blank for a moment. He had known that this was coming. After all, the children were missing, and there was no way they could have simply wandered into his life without raising alarms. The authorities would be looking for them. He had just hoped he would have a little more time to figure things out before this moment came. I found them last night," Jack said, trying to steady his voice. "They were alone on the streets. It was late, and they looked like they needed help. I couldn't just leave them there." Detective Jordan studied him for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to gauge Jack's sincerity. "We understand, Mr. Harris," the detective said finally, though his tone was measured. "But we have a responsibility to make sure these children are safe. We need to ask a few questions. If you don't mind." Jack stepped aside, letting the officers into the house. His pulse was racing as they entered, and he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much bigger than he could have anticipated. Nancy led the officers to the dining room, where Ethan and Mia were still eating. When they saw the detectives, Ethan stiffened, his eyes darting from the officers to Jack, as if seeking reassurance. Jack caught his gaze and gave him a small nod, hoping it would calm the boy, but it didn't seem to help. Ethan remained tense, his protective instincts flaring. "Is this them?" Detective Jordan asked, his voice gentle but direct. Jack nodded. "Yes. The boy's name is Ethan, and the baby is Mia. They were alone on the street last night." The officers exchanged a look, and then Detective Jordan knelt down to Ethan's level, speaking softly. "Ethan, we need to ask you some questions. Okay? We just want to make sure you and your sister are all right." Ethan didn't answer, but his eyes remained locked on the detective. There was an intensity in his gaze, one that Jack couldn't quite place. It was as if Ethan was weighing the situation, deciding whether or not to trust these people. "We'll help you." "Ethan," the detective continued, "but we need to know what happened. Can you tell us where your parents are?" The room seemed to hold its breath as Ethan sat there, still holding Mia in his arms, his face unreadable. Jack's heart ached as he watched the boy, his mind racing. What had happened to these children? Why were they alone? And what would they do next? The silence hung heavy, and for the first time, Jack realized that this wasn't just about helping two children. This was about uncovering a story far more complicated and far darker than he could have ever imagined. The silence in the room was thick, as though the weight of unspoken words hung heavy in the air. Ethan sat there, still clutching Mia, his young face a mixture of uncertainty and defiance. Detective Jordan waited patiently, but it was clear that Ethan wasn't ready to speak. Instead, he just stared back, his protective gaze never wavering. Jack stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Ethan," he said softly, trying to reach the boy without scaring him. "You don't have to say anything right now, but we're here to help you. Okay? No one's going to hurt you or Mia. We just want to know what happened." Ethan's eyes flickered, and for a brief moment, Jack thought he might speak. But then the boy's gaze shifted downward, as if the weight of his own thoughts was too much to bear. Mia cooed softly in his arms, oblivious to the tension in the room, and Jack couldn't help but feel a deep pang of sadness for the children. They had clearly been through something unimaginable. Detective Jordan gave Jack a quiet nod, then turned to his partner. Officer Ramirez stepped forward, his voice much softer now. "Ethan," she said, crouching down to his level, "we know you're scared, but we need to make sure you and Mia are safe. If you can just tell us where you're from, we'll do everything we can to help you." For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of Mia's soft babbling. Then, almost imperceptibly, Ethan's lips parted. His voice was a mere whisper, but it cut through the air like a knife. The shelter," Ethan said, his voice trembling slightly. "We were at the shelter, but then they came. They took us." Jack's heart sank. "They came?" The words hung in the air, a chilling implication behind them. He could see the fear in Ethan's eyes now, the memory of something terrible flooding back. "Who took you?" Detective Jordan asked urgently, his voice low but intense. Ethan shook his head, his eyes wide with panic. "I don't know. I don't know. But they said we were bad. They said we needed to go with them." It was a piece of the puzzle, but not enough to make sense of the whole picture. Jack exchanged a glance with the detective. Whoever had taken the children, whatever had happened, it wasn't just a simple case of abandonment. There was something darker at play here, something far more sinister. As the conversation continued, Ethan finally let slip the name of the shelter: Hope Haven, a small, struggling charity that provided temporary refuge for children in need. Jack's mind raced as he processed the information. He knew of the place, but it wasn't well known or well funded. For children to end up there, they must have been in dire circumstances. Detective Jordan made a few quick calls, coordinating with the local authorities. As he spoke with a colleague, Officer Ramirez remained with Jack, her expression thoughtful. "It sounds like these children have been through something terrible," Ramirez said softly. "We'll get to the bottom of it. Mr. Harris." "Don't worry." Jack nodded, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had gone terribly wrong, and that Ethan and Mia had been caught in the middle of something much bigger than any of them could understand. Whatever had happened to them, Jack knew he couldn't turn his back on them now. They weren't just victims, they were survivors, and they needed someone who believed in them. The next few days were a blur of investigations, paperwork, and questions. Hope Haven was raided, and the authorities uncovered a twisted network that had been exploiting vulnerable children. Jack learned that the people who had taken Ethan and Mia were part of a larger human trafficking ring, one that had been operating under the radar for years. It was a relief, but it was also heartbreaking. Ethan and Mia were placed in foster care, where they would receive the care and support they desperately needed. Jack continued to check in on them, visiting regularly, and though the road to recovery would be long, there was a glimmer of hope in their eyes that hadn't been there before. As for Jack, the experience had changed him. He had spent so many years focused on his career, his wealth, and his success that he had lost sight of what truly mattered. But when he found Ethan and Mia, everything shifted. In helping them, Jack found a new purpose, a sense of belonging that he had been missing all along. He had started out trying to save them, but in the end, it was they who had saved him. The story of Ethan and Mia and Jack's transformation wasn't just about two children finding safety. It was about the unexpected way that kindness and courage could change everything, even for those who least expected it. And as Jack sat in his office, looking out at the city, he knew that his life would never be the same again. It wasn't just about the mansion, the wealth, or the success. It was about the people we help, the lives we touch, and the moments when we dare to make a difference. Thank you for watching this heart-touching story. Jack's journey reminds us that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can lead to life-altering moments. We hope this story moved you as much as it did us. If you enjoyed it, please like, share, and subscribe for more stories that inspire.